every other means. It's been quite an adventure. We've had a major eye problem with looking at computers, and it's a real triumph that these two women are here today. Selma Odom, an eminent dance historian and writer, and she's Professor Emerita and Senior Scholar at the University of York, and also Adjunct Associate of the Centre of Drama, Theatre and Performance Studies, University of Toronto. My friend and colleague Joan in Australia is President of Dalcroze Australia and has been an officer of many associations, not only Dalcroze but of physical education, drama and dance. It's my great pleasure to introduce the centenary keynote speech. And before I go, this is the essay, centenary essay, £8.50, special price for you, from the Dalcroze Society Bookshop in the Ellen Terry Building, room 103.
130. 130.
130, right. So you won't hear all of this today. There are many wonderful pictures because we can't fit it in, but I highly recommend this as a latest history. We needed this history, and these two women have done a mighty job. Thank
you so much, Sandra and John, for inviting us. We are thrilled to be part of this celebration and to be here capturing the moment, the excitement of all of the new work that is coming forward and being communicated about in this conference. We also want to try in this hour today to evoke for you the excitement of the people who were the founders of the London School of Dalcroze 100 years ago, and to suggest a little bit about how they experienced the Dalcroze method and what it meant to them. Joan, would you like to?
I'd like to, of course, say how wonderful it is to be here. It's a long way to come and quite a few dollars, and so I'm very grateful to have received some assistance, both from Dalcroze Australia, not from the committee that I'm on, I hasten to say, but from a splendid committee that we had called the Heather Gell Dalcroze Foundation. When Miss Gell died, she left the estate, a little house, for the public good, and so a foundation was set up to further Dalcroze training. One of our trustees, Professor Jane Southcott, has been also able to come. So we're grateful to all of those means, and I would like to add my special thanks to my dear friend Patsy James, whom I met in 1953 at the Newton Road Training Centre. Oh, it's just right in front of me. It's the eye thing. So for your family archive has been a tremendous inspiration, I know, to both of us, and from then on to the various other archives of the world.
So, our talk is titled, and our essay as well, Practical Idealists, Founders of the London School of Dalcroze Rhythmics. The founders were a group of people. They were actually part of a family of visionary teachers who imagined this school and who took steps to make it happen. And the perhaps most important of these was Percy Broadbent Ingham, who became the director of the school and led the school from the point of view of finances, organization, logistics. He was responsible for making it known to the public as well as making it successful as an enterprise for the teachers and for thousands of students, children who were beneficiaries of this work. His co-founder was his wife, Ethel Haslam Ingham, who was the class supervisor originally. And it was such a family affair. His sister, Gertrude Ingham, was a part of the presentation of almost all of Jacques Dalcroze's public lectures and appearances because she translated for him into English. She was also the headmistress of Moira House School, which was the school behind the school. Moira House was a progressive girls' school founded in 1875 by the father of both Percy and Gertrude, who himself was bitten by the Dalcroze bug in a very early moment and began encouraging his staff to move along and find out about it. At that time, it meant going to the source on the continent. And the source himself, Émile Jacques Dalcroze, who was teaching in Geneva, where the work developed in the early 1900s, when Charles Ingham first went and found it, but then moved to Hellerau, Dresden, Germany, in 1910. And it was there that the Ingham family moved to take the whole thing on. They went first to study, Ethel, and then soon her husband, Percy, came, and eventually Gertrude came, and teachers from Moira House, as well as many others who came to study as part of a community, quite a unique community of international students, teachers, and artists who gathered in this new garden city in purpose-built modern facilities to work on this method, which they were actually part of creating. It was a collective experience and very much based on group interactions at all levels, lessons, events. One of the most exciting parts of every week was a session led by Émile Jacques Dalcroze, where the whole school would come together into a large space and work together for a several-hour session. While she was studying there, Ethel Ingham began to do some of the most revealing writing about the lessons and the whole experience of studying the Dalcroze method, what was central to it. And she spoke of ideas such as the habits of concentrated thinking, of quick and definite action, and of control over mind and body becoming established. She also spoke about the inventiveness of Jacques Dalcroze, who seldom repeats himself, how he had new ideas every day consisting of new movements or new uses for old ones, so that there's never a dull moment. The music, of course, is always improvised. It was through this improvisation, the ability that was described by Beryl de Zoet as his power to conjure a whole world from the keyboard through sound and silence, storm and tranquility. She wrote, "Scenes and emotions flowed from his fingers with inexhaustible wealth of fancy and a simplicity of means." And it was she who later wrote one of the most important essays. It's called A Tribute to My Master, Jacques Dalcroze. At the time of his death in 1950, she evoked the breadth of work and experience that he inspired, and the importance of thinking beyond experience that he also engendered in his students. Another of his important students, she was one of his students in the Hellerau period, and then finished her studies at the London School of Dalcroze Rhythmics. Another important person in that context was Marie Rambert, who was teaching movement at that time. And she also wrote very articulate memoirs of how Jacques Dalcroze actually inspired as a teacher. She said he was a brilliant musician, he was a genius at improvisation. That was the means by which he taught his method. And she also noted that he taught her punctuality, hard work, everything important. At Hellerau, the Inghams met and collaborated with the Sadler family to produce a little book you probably have seen, The Eurythmics of Jacques Dalcroze, which was published first in 1912 and then went through a number of subsequent editions. And it was in this book that the name Eurythmics was first presented and given definition. It was also a family affair with a group of people highly placed in educational circles who were enthusiasts for the new work and for what it might mean as a modern method of education. It came out at exactly 1912 when the first lecture demonstrations were led in England by Jacques Dalcroze. He was actually demonstrating with advanced children from Geneva at the time, and he went to 4 cities and gave 8 lectures, which were packed. One of the reports in the School Music Review said, "It's safe to say that thousands of teachers and others interested in educational matters are now discussing what they have seen and heard." So it was a big thing. The next year, he gave a subsequent tour of lecture demonstrations, of which this is a pictorial illustration from a magazine called The Graphic, with students from Hellerau. And in each case, you're seeing here a specific sort of area of work, a canon in 5/4 time at the top, conducting melodies by movements in the middle section, solfège, and then others at the bottom. You can probably see here Jacques Dalcroze at the piano on the right. Ethel Driver, who was a music teacher at an Anglican girls' school, and Edith Clark, who was an important teacher at the Deptford College of Physical Education, joined the large contingent of educators who went to study at Hellerau and after seeing one of these demonstrations. And they found there eminent musicians, one of whom was Ernest Reed, who were so excited they dropped everything, more or less, to go to Germany.
One quote, which I need my glasses. Uncle Ernie, he was known as to many people, in 1913 I got together 40 young musicians and teachers to go out to Hellerau. Oh, we had the time of our lives. We learnt a lot amongst an international gathering, which
are characters, and he is certainly one of them. We're jumping now forward to London and to the London School of Dalcroze Eurythmics on Store Street in Bloomsbury in 1915. The school is actually founded in 1913 and is very important during the year 1914 when Jacques Dalcroze decided not to return to Hellerau when the war broke out. And so for that 1 year, it was the center for advanced training before the Institut Jacques Dalcroze was founded in 1915. The school went from strength to strength, led wonderfully well by a group of people, several of whom had come from Hellerau. Before we leave this image, I just want to point out Jacques Dalcroze is here, and he came annually until 1939, sometimes as many times as 3 times a year. So he kept an incredibly close association with the London school. It was his other school. And then on the right, in the foreground, is Percy Ingham. And we think Gertrude Ingham by his side, just to the left of him in the picture. And a number of the other key people. I read to you a little statement by Beryl de Zoet, who is sitting down here on the left on the floor. And as we look at this, we can also remember that in the year 1915, the Dalcroze Society was founded. Right away, there was a sense of the need for such an organization to support, to provide lectures and demonstrations in schools all over the country. This organization in its first year took shape with over 230 members, which I think is fascinating in light of how currently I think the Dalcroze Society Facebook organization has about 225, almost the same size. And it's fun to be part of that, even from afar. I'm a follower of that site, of the communication and the activities of so many different people. But I hope that in those days the society was also doing that for all its members, giving them a sense of who's doing what and how they might reach more and more people and more schools. In the next year, in 1916, the Dalcroze Teachers Union was established to support teachers and their interests. This was organized and led by Winifred Houghton and a group of people who felt that they needed to do something to maintain the standard of work and protect the interests of Dalcroze teachers. And it was actually one of the first unions of that kind founded.
And a little tiny quote from Miss Phyllis Hall Wilson said, "Please, members, do send your subscriptions of 2 and 6pence, for we are the smallest union in Great Britain." And by the way, particularly for Americans, this is Gladys Wells, who lived round about then and standing above Beryl Deserby. And so she landed in Cleveland and then New York, 1916.
So we have to go jumping through the next parts of the history, having introduced some of these remarkable characters because time is passing. Here they are, a lot of these teachers and colleagues gathered at Kew Gardens in 1920. Rambert still connected, Annie Beck, who was so important, a teacher at Hellerau. Right in the foreground in the center is Edith Clark. Ethel Driver. I sometimes make these mistakes.
Which one is Marie Rambert?
Rambert has a hat with a feather in the back row. Desert is sitting here on the right in the foreground. And you see Jacques Dalcroze right in the middle, of course. This image, which was in Punch the same year, 1920, shows international eurythmics. It's actually based on the idea of a Dalcroze demonstration showing 2 simultaneous rhythms with contrasting locomotions. So the war-weary allies are crouching at the back, in contrast to the generous and enthusiastic American President Wilson, who is galloping across the front at a time when reparations are under debate.
Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Orlando.
And now, a good picture of Ethel Driver from an article called Women Who Made Good. And she's pointing out that there is huge amount of potential for women who would like to become Dalcroze teachers, many more positions than there are teachers to fill them. The 20s were a time of expansion and incredible development. Ingham persuaded Ernest Reed to come to the school now as a member of the staff and serve as director of musical studies to complement the remarkable leadership work of Ethel Driver, who was then called Mistress of Method. Now she would probably be Director of Studies. But at that point, she led the studies and the training, whereas Ernest Reed was a type of translator to the wider world of music and music education. He was simultaneously teaching at the Royal Academy of Music and at Queenswood School, where he introduced the Dalcroze work in 1921. And by enlisting Reed to teach harmony, conducting, and choral singing, Ingham not only enriched the school's offerings, but strengthened the links between Dalcroze rhythmics and the rest of the field of music education. He also brought in other important teachers to teach fields like areas like history of music, and was able to connect the teachers and the students with a range of supporters, really, from music education and the press through the planning and work that he led at the school. The staff developed a team approach for the Dalcroze subjects, which were the core areas that became the distinctive curriculum as it grew and developed through several generations of teaching in England. And the enactment of the programs had a widening through summer schools, such as this one. This was one of the early ones held in Oxford, where lots and lots of people would come, sometimes teachers and administrators, but then also people who might be recruited into the Dalcroze training. I'm going to back up here to show you the summer school at Bangor, where we see the excitement of a group outside. A lot of the work was actually what we would now call site-specific performance, and included were clearly connected to what is happening at the same period in choreography and also in theater. This is another event at Bangor on the stairs, the same sort of space as at Hellerau, actually, with robes and gestures. And if you read our centenary essay, you'll find out quite a lot about the involvement of people in the Dalcroze world with the staging of drama in this period.
And everyone wore kimonos from class to class. So they were called Chinese dressing gowns or kimono. And so he just said, wear what you usually wear between class and dressing room and we'll make an event.
So I'm almost finished here. I'm just going to show you a picture of Cecilia, John, and colleagues taking the work to the wider world.
Here is Ethel Driver. Here is Heather Gill, squashed in the middle, who taught Sandra and myself. I'm not certain of the name of the other one. The picture was taken in 1923-24 when Miss Driver and Miss Gill and Miss John all came out to Australia and New Zealand for 6 months or so. Leading the way. There was a clause in the Constitution which said, and to take the eurythmics of Jacques Dalcroze to the British Empire, otherwise known as the ends of the earth.
And so just to finish here, we have a wonderful image of Anne Driver in the center in a display, in a demonstration with several of her colleagues in the late 1920s. These were public presentations at places like the La Scala Theatre. They were Scala Theatre, I should say, and very well attended and very formally complete evening programs or afternoons.
So you're going to have to whiz through the lovely next 4 pictures and
that's what I'm doing. So we have here Winifred Houghton, who led the way to develop the work as part of state school education, working with a group, and I believe connecting them by way of elastics. If you look really closely at the picture, you can see that they're using that prop, which has such a long and interesting life in the practice. And here are girls at Moira House School, one of whom is in the foreground, Mona Swan, who becomes later the headmistress of the Moira House. We're kind of coming back around full circle here to the school that supported the work initially. She developed the idea of language eurythmics, and at Moira House, the concept really was that eurythmics was foundational to all the study of the school. That included history, literature, and everything. So she was a great pioneer, and the idea of progressivism in education was highly supportive to all the work in Dalcroze. This is another famous school, the Hall School, where works were done, and Queenswood, the school that Ernest Reed was long associated with. And finally, I will turn over to Joan. I'm not going to tell you that Chrissy Ingham died in 1930, because perhaps you'll learn that when you read the essay.
This was the turning point for both our essay and indeed the school itself. I'm leaving this picture up for a short while, and I'll ask Selma, would you mind staying here and be the press button girl for the next series? When Ingham died, it was a huge shock and a terrible disappointment to everyone. Financially, it was a disaster. Ingham had put £2,000, then £2,000 in those decades, that money, of his personal earnings into the school. To suddenly not have that was a disaster in all sorts of ways. And inviting Jacques Dalcroze to come over 3 times a year was not a cheap exercise. And Mr. Jacques knew very well what he needed to charge. The other thing that drastically affected a great many people was that Ingham had actually organised contracts for all the teachers, both within Greater London and in Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham and Sheffield and several other places. Not quite such an extent in Scotland, they were more independent up there. But in Australia and in South Africa, there were 8 or 9 teachers went out in the 20s to South Africa. Contracts were drawn up by Mr. Ingham. This is the 1929 Nancy Rosenheim contract, signed and sealed and beautifully bound by Mr. Ingham, beautiful parchment, a proper legal document where he agrees to send her in advance bank drafts that she will agree when she's teaching in the city of Melbourne not to interfere but to help with the other Dalcroze teacher who is also in a similar situation of support. Miss Weber, who was an ex-Moira House girl, as indeed Ingham's wife had been, Miss Weber was the first secretary to Ingham at the school, and in fact remained so until the school closed in 1955. I mean, that is an extremely long years of service. Miss Weber wrote to Nancy Rosenheim in Melbourne and saying, we cannot know with this sad news, of course it took a week by, more than, it took nearly a month of course to get there, although they did have a cable address with Eurhythm. You must come home immediately. With Mr. Ingham's death, we can no longer guarantee weekly grant drafts, and your return fare to England will not be able to be guaranteed. So Nancy had to leave the school she'd set up, come home via the States, in which he called in on Paul Berkeley in New York, and he said, no, it's the Depression, there's hardly any jobs here either. So it was a very bad time all around. I was in contact a few years ago when I was doing my doctoral studies, which was about the Australians and New Zealanders who came to the London school and who then went back home. Nancy Rosenheim's son said, oh, I've got mum's stuff, would you be interested? Therefore, I have her contract, her actual certificate, the actual piece of paper that said which subject she must prepare for her exam, and sundry prospectuses. And would you believe that they came in an old folder of hers from a student who, at that time, in the 1960s or perhaps, was a second-year student at her university classes when she was Mrs. Kersner, and the name is Robert Pritchard. Now, this may interest some of you because he is now on your board, I believe. There we are. Things happen. Now, what happened when Ingham died? Let's have a look at Cecilia. Cecilia, who had joined the school as a student when she was age 44, 45, with a lot of experience behind her, and I won't go into much because I'm putting a poster up tomorrow. Suffragette, feminist, Melbourne editor of the Woman Voter, and really on with it. Suddenly, in 1919, went to Geneva because she was in Zurich, one of the 3 Australian women at the International Peace Conference. And clearly she heard and saw about Dalcroze rhythmics. She completed her studies. She was on the committee of the Dalcroze Society even when she was a 3rd-year student. And after his death, Ingham's wife and sister, Ethel and Gertrude, and the committee set up a management board, and Celia became in charge of that, so in lieu principle. She also, in a almost voluntary capacity, was the overseas director for the Save the Children Fund, for whom this photo was taken. Next slide. one of the main projects that she and the committee were involved in after his death was the Percy Ingham Memorial Fund, so that his wish that the school could not just be in a little pokey bit above a Bloomsbury furniture store and have to walk down there for a hall and over to there a couple of streets away for more music rooms for Uncle Ernie. And by 1934, sufficient funds had been raised to have this particular elegant little Adams building in Fitzroy Square opened, and the joyous part of that was that they were able to say, at last, the London School of Dalcroze Arithmetic has facilities for men as well as women. Because up to that time, blokes who wanted to come, it was like a girl in those days wanting to do engineering, there weren't the appropriate facilities. However, this was not going to last them very long. Oh, by the way, the architect who renovated and designed all the rooms most beautifully inside was Christopher Mouth, whose daughter had been one of the early students in the 1915 time, the one who designed Guildford Cathedral, a very distinguished modern architect. Of course, not long later, let's have another slide. Inside, look, I mean, he had a nice feeling for how, not quite as grand as Hellerau, and not quite as grand as the Grand Salle in Geneva, but a nice little 1935 picture and on. And very nice little 1936 summer school. Very nice letter from Cecilia John saying, "Oh, Mr. Jack, it would be so nice if we could have arithmetics by the seaside. So many of our teachers would like to have a holiday, and perhaps we could just have a 1-week course this year instead of 3 years." He wrote back and said, "Impossible. If they're here to work, they're here to work. They can't have a holiday. It's a 3-week course." And I thank the Institute of Dalcroze for their access to their archives, because the correspondence which they have, which is about England, is phenomenal. Next slide, please. What happened was the war, okay, 1939. They knew war was coming. Hardly anyone turned up to any committee meetings. There was the first scary bits of noise and bombing. By 1942, that beautiful Fitzroy was bombed. It was bombed for the second time and then had to be demolished for obvious reasons. And so Celia John, in her bossy way, said, "Right, well, we must evacuate." And she found one place after another. Popped down to Glastonbury Park near Kent for a while to a girls' school, which they sort of muscled in on. Nipped up to Staffordshire. This was a home that's now demolished. Had been the Spode family home. So as one of the students plaintively said, we had... There were only about 16 students at this stage, it was obviously residential, said, "Oh, we had the most beautiful crockery. We even had little Spode butter dishes, but of course it was rationing, so there was no butter." So they were there for 3 or 4 years, and people did graduate. Of course, by this time, Dalcroze himself personally was not coming over. His last visit had been in 1939. Next slide. After a while, the committee and Cecilia found the old manor house down at Lippel called Milland Place. It was next to an 11th century monastery with a mill, so Milland. And it had been used by other schools in the recent past. So here we have a very interesting name change. The London School of Dalcroze Arithmetics Training College, now, although there's nothing formal in the minutes that I can find, becomes known as the Dalcroze College, and is clearly residential. Celia, being a bit of a crack shot at banging off a rabbit and getting in a fox who was taking her chooks. Well, she was a judge, an agricultural judge of poultry, by the way, amongst children farmers and women both and everything else she did. Celia did the cooking. And one of the Australian students who went to Milland Place in 1950 said, "Oh, we had a bit of rationing after the war still in Australia, but nothing like what they had in England." And Cecilia would head the table on a Sunday morning, preparing for the Sunday roast, which was minuscule. It was a rabbit or something like that, which the students had been horrified. She actually snared rabbits, and they ate them without realising that Celia had been sneaking out, getting the dinner. And so she cooked, she fed, and she became more and more terrifying. She became more and more Wagnerian, and her hair was in steely little rows, and she wore serious suits, that sort of wartime fabric, you know, so it's pretty scary. And the students, in fact, were a bit scared of her. If you had Celia on teaching practice, you would be quite nervous, you know, because you didn't know that she had to do a supplementary herself in 1923. Dalcroze gave her a provisional certificate, and on account she just needed a bit more practice. Cleverly, she got some practice by palling up with Ethel Driver, the best teacher in the world. They were from then on inseparable companions. Let's have the next slide. This is the opening of Milan Place. The Prime Minister's wife, Mrs. Attlee, Clement Attlee, Prime Minister, is there in the official party opening it. I mean, there's no mucking around. We've got vice presidents with, you know, the Marchioness of this and the Viscount of that and the, you know, big deal committee. And this gorgeous leaping lady showing her knickers is, guess who? Elizabeth van der Spa. Well, she was Elizabeth, not van der Spa. Obviously. Next slide, please. This has nothing to do with, it's just that she had a cartoon with 4 people in, so I thought I needed a cartoon with 4 people in. This was done in Perth, my hometown, at the training college where my mum was the rhythmics and folk dance teacher in 1923, and in fact she actually has that, now I do, the 1912 book that you mentioned, because when the ladies came out on tour in 23, like Sue Hamilton and Patsy James, they carried bags and bags of books to sell, right? So I have some historical things to use my mum. I just think this is absolutely lovely. 4 blokes, you know, on the tennis court of the Teachers' College, having a rhythmics boom. Next slide, please. On we go. This is another gorgeous Australian one. Observe the gum tree. An English woman called Mary Winborn, and the particular thing is this allows me to mention Selma and I had this marvellous thing of finding one after another of this particular circle. You know, it's that circle. Everyone's up, it puts an exercise in crescendo, and often a circle within a circle within a circle, so it's an exercise of canon and crescendo. And it's the singing flowers. And that early picture of Hellerau, where there were 5 circles, and Jack Dalcroze at the keyboard, oh, that's some fantastic descriptions of it, but it was one of their things. And you see that group, you can bet your bottom dollar it's had a bit of a Eurythmics lady playing with it. Let's have the next slide. By 1947, just after the Milan Place had been got up and got going as a residential, the committee, mainly of the Dalcroze Teachers Union and the Society, made a bit of a special trip to a summer school in Geneva. And Patsy, as a young thing, was there. Because this is her mum, Edith Neff. Right at the back with the glasses is Houghty. Over here is Ethel. Here's Phyllis Craw-Wilson. This is Nat Tingy in the middle. And Priscilla Barkley above here with the curly-whirly hair. And Desiree Martin, whom we remember very well. And Ruth Stewart, you read that lovely note from Ruth. You must have been in the same class as Ruth at Newton Road, yeah. Desiree's wonderful. She always wore a turban. And next to her, the pretty one is Joan Bottard. Joan Ward Higgs was the sister of Natalie, who was Natalie Ward Higgs. So, a few others. They're fantastic staff. And anyway, basically they bailed out to Geneva, trying to find out how they could satisfy the British government, the education department, or whatever it's called, sorry, I'm getting a bit fast here, they needed to be assured that the qualification that was being issued would be acceptable on a rate of pay salary charges for work in England. And the dilemma was that the British government, or whichever department it was, regarded it as a foreign qualification. Raising this with Monsieur Jacques was not easy, and his son, Gabi, was, in other words, the dad of Martine, whom we saw this morning, was due to be at the meeting, take questions to Monsieur Jacques at lunchtime and come back with the answer. A very ticklish situation. Anyway, it was gradually resolved, but not really until 1952. All those Burnham rates and pay scales and stuff, if you know your English history. A very, very tricky meeting. Let's have next slide. Guess who? It's Mrs. Tingy. Nat Tingy not only rode a push bike, smoked a pipe, And she got her OBE for doing, basically one of the people who began Meals on Wheels during the war. I mean, almost all the committee, all the teachers did voluntary war service. Mrs. Van der Spa was on searchlight duty, which is, oh, it was lovely. We could play all these patterns in the sky. Searchlights, rhythms in the sky. Quite a few. There were 2 Australians who'd been studying. They turned into they were voluntary ambulance drivers. And Mrs. Tengi's worked with the with Meals on Wheels in desperate blitz conditions earned her. It's like another side of her life that, you know, maybe Dalcroze teachers didn't know about. There's lots of double lives in the Dalcroze world, you know, the bit that earns you money and the bit that does good and then the bit you love doing. Very interesting. But I just love that picture. She used to live at Dolphin Square, but that doesn't look like Dolphin Square. No, yeah. All right, next slide is, thank goodness, Mrs. Tingy here wrote a little history summing up the first 30 years, and it's been very valuable to us. And then, of course, years later, in 1973, and this one, this is very battered, but there's a fresh new copy of this in the bookshop, should you wish to go. Be warned, Mrs. Tingy's got quite a few little errors. You know, it's not absolutely hunky-dory 100%. I know. She's muddled Patsy and her mother up, and you know, she's got James' diploma 1923 or something, or whatever. We know Patsy didn't get her diploma in 1923. You know, wise and aged though she may be, not that old. But her mum, as someone in this room recently has Félicitations of the jury for hers. Where are you? Where's Félicitations? Oh, there she is, Beth. You've got a Félicitations thing from the jury for your diploma. So did Patsy's mum in Paris in 1925. So please have a look at this. We would not have been able to do what we have done and wish to correct. I mean, all of these things are, here's a wrong spelling or here's a wrong date, but the basic capturing is fantastic. And time after time, we are finding that people make connections with wonderful comments in here from Rebecca Clark, who, like Gladys Wells in those early days, was a phys ed teacher. She taught at, what's the one? Is it Dart? Edith Clark. Edith Clark was a teacher at Dartford. Dartford. Yeah, a hugely important phys ed, which had also training women phys edists to go out hither and yon. Last year or so, Sandra was teaching in Melbourne. Someone came up to her and said, oh, I had an aunt who did Dalcroze. My God, it was Rebecca Clark's aunt. Sensibly, Sandra sort of said, oh, good, what's your address? And then when I was in Melbourne a couple of months ago, I got in contact and said, have you by any chance got, you know, pictures and things of them? Said, oh, look, we're just going back to England for a year or so, but I'll be in touch. So I've sent her Auntie Rebecca's bit about this, and it's amazing that this history of Dalcroze stuff is about a family who supported it, and yet we keep coming across families who themselves have histories. The number of people in this back bit who are graduates, who are sisters of, or daughters of, or cousins of, it's a very small circle in a funny sort of way, and it perhaps has something to do with a word of mouth. How does the word get round? One person says to one other, one teacher says to one other, this is something that you would like. So, we brought the story up to here. Sandra, what do you think is going to happen now, apart from us finishing?
Does it go to 1955?
Ah, yes, oh dear, it's very sad, yes. Well, you see, things got worse and worse. Financially, this was mortgaged, that was in trouble. There were not particularly good financial advice given. Legal advice was a bit sus. By the time Cecilia John died in 1955, it was not possible for Ethel Driver and Alice Weber to keep on going. So good old Uncle Ernie, who started them off in 1912, was still there in 1955, seeing the lawyers and working out the mortgages and having sad tales to tell. But prior to that, some of that group of teachers from a few years ago, a couple of slides ago, had started, let's have we can't call it the London School quite anymore. We'll have the Dalcroze Training Centre in London, in Newton Road. That started at 49, 50, 59, I don't know. When Senior John died in 55, Uncle Ernie was able to say, why don't we? Why doesn't the society now come to a proper rescue and the school reside in the society and we all help each other? There have been some wonderful comments some years before. Douglas Murray, who was one of the few British male graduates, said, why on earth is it that we can have the three branches of eurythmics, rhythmic, movement, solfege, and improvisation, all working together to form eurythmics? And yet here we have the school, the society, and the union all kind of tearing each other apart. Surely we can be adult enough to learn to put them all together. So there's some hugely interesting history. I do hope some of you will become as passionate about history as some of us have. It's not that we're not interested in the future, but my goodness, there's a few wheels that come around again every couple of decades. I'll tell you what, Sandra, we need to make it finish, otherwise Ruth will never get a chance to begin.
Well, I would like to...
Thank you very much, Selma and Joan, for an illuminating presentation about the history of the school. We're very conscious that officially this story finished at 1955, but of course we're all here now, it's 2013. If you buy the centenary essay, there is another section called Circles Rippling Out, which is about the school in the UK, United Kingdom, since 1955. It's a short passage, but it would be very, very long to try and go into all the details. But I think there are a number of very interesting issues that come up in the wonderful talk we've had. First of all, congratulations to Selma and Joan for a wonderful effort and for finding so many illuminating pictures for us to see today. Many of them have not been seen before. I had the privilege of reading the centenary essay that I was talking about earlier. I read it as Joan and Selma were working on it, and one of the outstanding characteristics of these people was their incredible devotion to duty. Once they'd tasted eurythmics, the Inghams, the Ethel Drivers, Anne Drivers, and so many teachers and students worked very hard, were very dedicated, and I think that's still true today, that we have very many dedicated Dalcroze teachers who do a lot of work for the love of the subject and because we know the power that this work has. However, for a long time, many teachers did their work for love, not money. And of course today, 100 years later, we live in a different environment. We live in quite a different educational context where we seek professional recognition, where we seek to be recognised by schools and universities. We are still we still have this drive, and I think it's true to say there is still a struggle, because the need for space, the need for the right working conditions to teach eurythmics is not easy to find. We've been very lucky here at Coventry to have the beautiful facilities of this university, but many conservatoria and universities still do not recognise or even understand what we are saying. So I think this battle of how to communicate what we do and how to disseminate the work remains an important issue. Back in the days of the Inghams, in the early days, they gave many demonstrations. And I don't just mean within a circle of people who were already converted, so to speak, but in public concert halls. The Queen's Hall in London held over 2,000 people. When Jacques Dalcroze came and gave a demonstration, it was packed. That gives you an idea of the huge public interest in this work. It really was like an explosion, and everybody wanted to be part of it. After the repression of the 19th century educational methods, here was something that made people feel so good, that they could learn music. It was not about drill. It was not about making mistakes and suffering. It was about living and being alive, about working with groups and being creative, finding your own creative power. And I think for these incredible people, they found their creative power. It lit the flame in them. I know from my studies of Heather Gell, I often wondered, how did she do what she did? She was fired up by this inner flame, and without that, she could not have done it. And I think that these people had the same thing. So I draw your attention to this devotion to duty, but that we do need to come into the world of the 21st century. We have come into an age of economic rationalism. Universities are looking at budgets, space costs money, rooms with pianos cost money. We have to be able to articulate what we are doing and why it is so important. But I'm glad to say the number of people who've come to this conference is very heartening, because I think there's still a huge interest in Dalcroze and what it has to offer, and I think there are a lot of very exciting possibilities. If one look at the conference proceedings can inform us. The dissemination of the work. Yes, I think, as Joan was mentioning, there were the three branches. First of all, there was the school, and then there was the society, and the Dalcroze Teachers Union. The Dalcroze Teachers Union was an incredibly important body for teachers in Australia and other countries to keep in contact with their colleagues and friends in London. That also was the link to Geneva, and the endless letters about, have the subscriptions been paid yet? And do we pay Geneva or do we pay London? You know, Australia was for many years like a subsidiary of London. It took a long time for us to become our own representative until Miss Jill had her diploma. But I think we cannot underestimate the importance of the body of graduates, the people who do the training, who take responsibility for the training, what would have been called the school or what would have been called the Dalcroze Teachers Union, because after all, this is what's going to ensure a future for the work. We must have a big priority placed on teacher education, and it's hard to do that when you don't have a full-time course within an institution. So I think a lot of us are very mindful of this element. That's probably...
Guess who? It's Mrs. Tingy. Nat Tingy not only rode a push bike, smoked a pipe, and she got her OBE for doing basically one of the people who began Meals on Wheels during the war. I mean, almost all the committee, all the teachers did voluntary war service. Mrs. Van der Spa was on searchlight duty. She said, oh, it was lovely, we could play all these patterns in the sky. Searchlights, rhythms in the sky. Quite a few. There were 2 Australians who'd been studying. They turned into they were voluntary ambulance drivers. And Mrs. Tingy's worked with Meals on Wheels in desperate blitz conditions, earned her. It's like another side of her life that, you know, maybe Dalcroze teachers didn't know about. There are lots of double lives in the Dalcroze world. You know, the bit that earns you money and the bit that does good, and then the bit you love doing. You know, very interesting. But I just love that picture. She used to live at Dolphin Square, but that doesn't look like Dolphin Square. No, yeah. All right, next slide is, thank goodness, Mrs. Tingy here wrote a little history summing up the first 30 years, and it's been very valuable to us. And then, of course, years later, in 1973, and this one this is very battered, but there's a fresh new copy of this in the bookshop, should you wish to go. Be warned, Mrs. Tingy's got quite a few little errors. You know, it's not absolutely hunky-dory 100%. I know! She's muddled Patsy and her mother up, and you know, she's got James' diploma 1923 or something, or whatever. We know Patsy didn't get her diploma in 1923. You know, wise and aged though she may be, not that old. But her mum, as someone in this room recently has felicitation of the jury for hers. Where are you? Where's felicitation of the... Oh, there she is, Beth. You've got a felicitation thing from the jury for your diploma. So did Patsy's mum in Paris in 1925. So please have a look at this. We would not have been able to do what we have done and wish to correct. I mean, all of these things are, here's a wrong spelling or here's a wrong date, but the basic capturing is fantastic. And time after time, we are finding that people make connections with wonderful comments in here from Rebecca Clark, who, like Gladys Wells in those early days, was a phys ed teacher. She taught at, what's the one? Is it Dart? Edith Clark. Edith Clark was a teacher, is it Dartford? Dartford. Yeah, a hugely important phys ed, which had also training women phys eders to go out hither and yon. Last year or so, Sandra was teaching in Melbourne. Someone came up to her and said, oh, I had an aunt who did Dalcroze. My God, it was Rebecca Clark's aunt. Sensibly, Sandra sort of said, oh, good, what's your address? And then when I was in Melbourne a couple of months ago, I got in contact and said, have you by any chance got, you know, pictures and things of them? Said, oh, look, we're just going back to England for a year or so, but I'll be in touch. So I've sent her Auntie Rebecca's bit about this, and it's amazing that this history of Dalcroze stuff is about a family who supported it, and yet we keep coming across families who themselves have histories. The number of people in this back bit who are graduates, who are sisters of, or daughters of, or cousins of, it's a very small circle in a funny sort of way, and it perhaps has something to do with a word of mouth. How does the word get round? One person says to one other, one teacher says to one other, this is something that you would like. So, we brought the story up for here. Sandra, what do you think is going to happen now, apart from us finishing?
Does it go to 1955?
Ah, yes, oh dear, it's very sad. Yes. Well, you see, things got worse and worse. Financially, this was mortgaged, that was in trouble. There were not particularly good financial advice given. Legal advice was a bit sus. By the time Cecilia and John died in 1955, it was not possible for Ethel Driver and Alice Weber to keep on going. So good old Uncle Ernie, who started them off in 1912, was still there in 1955, seeing the lawyers and working out the mortgages and having sad tales to tell. But prior to that, some of that group of teachers from a few years ago, a couple of slides ago, had started, let's have, we can't call it the London School quite anymore, we'll have the Dalcroze Training Centre in London, in Newton Road. They started it 49, 50, 59, I don't know, when Celia John died in 55, Uncle Ernie was able to say, why don't we? Why doesn't the society now come to a proper rescue and the school reside in the society and we all help each other? There'd been some wonderful comments some years before. Douglas Murray, who was one of the few British male graduates, said, why on earth is it that we can have the three branches of eurythmics, rhythmic, movement, solfège, and improvisation, all working together to form eurythmics? And yet here we have the school, the society, and the union all kind of tearing each other apart. Surely we can be adult enough to learn to put them all together. So there's some hugely interesting history. I do hope some of you will become as passionate about history as some of us have. It's not that we're not interested in the future, but my goodness, there's a few wheels that come around again every couple of decades, I'll tell you what. Yeah. Sandra, we need to make it finish, otherwise Ruth will never get a chance to begin.
Well, I would like to...
Thank you very much. Selma and Joan for an illuminating presentation about the history of the school. We're very conscious that officially this story finished at 1955, but of course we're all here now, it's 2013. If you buy the centenary essay, there is another section called Circles Rippling Out, which is about the school in the UK, the United Kingdom, since 1955. It's a short passage, but it would be very, very long to try and go into all the details. But I think there are a number of very interesting issues that come up in the wonderful talk we've had. First of all, congratulations to Selma and Joan for a wonderful effort and for finding so many illuminating pictures for us to see today. Many of them have not been seen before. I had the privilege of reading the centenary essay that I was talking about earlier. I read it as Joan and Selma were working on it, and one of the outstanding characteristics of these people was their incredible devotion to duty. Once they'd tasted eurythmics, the Inghams, the Ethel Drivers, Anne Drivers, and so many teachers and students worked very hard, were very dedicated, and I think that's still true today, that we have very many dedicated Dalcroze teachers who do a lot of work for the love of the subject and because we know the power that this work has. However, for a long time, many teachers did their work for love, not money. And of course today, 100 years later, we live in a different environment. We live in quite a different educational context where we seek professional recognition, where we seek to be recognised by schools and universities. We are still we still have this drive, and I think it's true to say there is still a struggle, because the need for space, the need for the right working conditions to teach eurythmics is not easy to find. We've been very lucky here at Coventry to have the beautiful facilities of this university, but many conservatoria and universities still do not recognise or even understand what we are saying. So I think this battle of how to communicate what we do and how to disseminate the work remains an important issue. Back in the days of the Inghams, in the early days, they gave many demonstrations. And I don't just mean within a circle of people who were already converted, so to speak, but in public concert halls. The Queen's Hall in London held over 2,000 people. When Jacques Dalcroze came and gave a demonstration, it was packed. That gives you an idea of the huge public interest in this work. It really was like an explosion, and everybody wanted to be part of it. After the repression of the 19th century educational methods, here was something that made people feel so good, that they could learn music. It was not about drill. It was not about making mistakes and suffering. It was about living and being alive, about working with groups and being creative, finding your own creative power. And I think for these incredible people, they found their creative power. It lit the flame in them. I know from my studies of Heather Gell, I often wondered, how did she do what she did? She was fired up by this inner flame, and without that, she could not have done it. And I think that these people had the same thing. So I draw your attention to this devotion to duty, but that we do need to come into the world of the 21st century. We have come into an age of economic rationalism. Universities are looking at budgets, space costs money, rooms with pianos cost money. We have to be able to articulate what we are doing and why it is so important. But I'm glad to say the number of people who've come to this conference is very heartening, because I think there's still a huge interest in Dalcroze and what it has to offer, and I think there are a lot of very exciting possibilities. If one look at the conference proceedings can inform us. The dissemination of the work. Yes, I think, as Joan was mentioning, there were the three branches. First of all, there was the school, and then there was the society, and the Dalcroze Teachers Union. The Dalcroze Teachers Union was an incredibly important body for teachers in Australia and other countries to keep in contact with their colleagues and friends in London. That also was the link to Geneva, and the endless letters about have the subscriptions been paid yet? And do we pay Geneva or do we pay London? You know, Australia was for many years like a subsidiary of London. It took a long time for us to become our own representative until Miss Jill had her diploma. But I think we cannot underestimate the importance of the body of graduates, the people who do the training, who take responsibility for the training, what would have been called the school or what would have been called the Dalcroze Teachers Union, because after all, this is what's going to ensure a future for the work. We must have a big priority placed on teacher education, and it's hard to do that when you don't have a full-time course within an institution. So I think a lot of us are very mindful of this element. That's probably enough from me, but I would like to ask if there are any questions from you at this stage. Oh my. Oh, question?
Can I just say
Cut
something?
the microphone, please. Cut the microphone. Thanks.
Handheld.
Thank you.
And there was one slide that we forgot, Selma. There was an absolutely marvellous picture of a little tiny cottage in the New Forest, which Ethel Driver and Cecilia John shared. I mean, it looks like one of those Walls cottages from A.A. Milne or something. And it was a tiny little snap that Jane Vincent, the name Jane Vincent should ring a few bells with you, took in 1925, and it somehow got lost. Okay.
Just a quick thing. I'm in connection with the project manager at Rambert. I'm taking classes with Deborah Galloway. And the Rambert Dance Company are moving to the South Bank this autumn, just in time for the centenary of the London Dalcroze School. And she wants to have a Dalcroze presence as part of their exhibitions and their workshops as well. So I've been communicating with her about that, and I've got questions to ask people. But I will let her know about that photo. She's also got archive stuff of Rambert at Dalcroze, but I will tell her about that lovely photograph at Kew Gardens with Mary Rambert and London.
Well, actually, that came from the Rambert archive.
Did it?
Yes,
Fantastic.
because the Rambert archivist before the current one, Jane Pritchard, has fed materials to me for decades, really, about Rambert. And coincidentally, I've recently written a new article about Rambert's work with Nijinsky on Le Sacre du Printemps, which will also include that image of Rambert. It hasn't actually been published until our little centenary essay.
Yay!
So it's a first. But it's a wonderful story, and I think the moment of 1913 when the school was founded was a particularly remarkable month of July in London, when Le Sacre du Printemps was being presented for the first time. Actually, Jacques Dalcroze and his wife Nina Faliero were performing in London in early July of 1913 and reviewed in the Times, I discovered this year. And of course, the great march of the suffragists were arriving, and everything was actually happening around July 24th, 5th, and 6th. It's rather cosmic, we're timing, John. But this was the march that brought women from every village of England practically into motion to converge in Hyde Park. And it's really quite fascinating to find how present Jacques Dalcroze is in the newspapers, in that he is actually referred to in both of the reviews of Le Sacre du Printemps in the Times in July, which are, you know, rather interesting references. So he's very public and very known in that moment.
Final question.
Any more questions? Jen.
Not so much a question, it's just to say that it is absolutely fascinating as we look at the history.
Yes.
As we look at the history that Dalcroze has really informed British education fundamentally. But when the 1949 Act came in, Dalcroze was not supported as a method of teaching music in Britain. And that, I think, has had severe consequences. Looking at the education of Britain, and even today, you see a real recognition of what actually the Dalcroze approach it cultivates in children. And there is a hunger for this ability to have focused activity with imagination and creativity. And our world is crying out for that. And I feel it very deeply, because really, within what we teach, is something that people are looking for in today's very troubled society. And it starts from the very youngest. It's not always seen, but actually it should be inculcated right from the word go, which is what some of us are trying to do. But that it should be spoken about in educational circles, because, you know, our society is dying for a need for this sort of combined discipline and creativity. And it's what's recognised from other people across the world, which is why they come to Britain for education. But we need to stand up and say, this is what we have.
Thanks very much, Cynthia. I think we're out of time.
Yep.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and big thank you once again to Selma and Joan. Job well done.